All right. So moving on, we're going to move now to the virtual reality, and I have with me on link from Stockholm. Hello, good morning, Linnea. How are you doing?
Good morning, Per. Hope you're doing well.
Great to see you. Thanks for joining us. Linnea Östedt Harrison, you're the creative director of Neat Corporation, and we can see the title of your game on your T-shirt. It's Budget Cuts, and you were a trailblazer in virtual reality with that game when that first came out, and many others have followed. Linnea, please tell us the story.
All right, thank you. So today I would love to tell you a little bit about our approach to games in general, virtual reality specifically, new hardware, new technologies, how we managed to, what I think the key to our success there was, and also a little bit about our studio itself. So a lot of different themes to talk about. So let's just jump into
Oh
the
no,
big stuff. If we can go on to the next slide,
we're losing you. Oh.
I would love to talk a little bit about.
Okay, I think our tech team is working hard to.
That's okay.
While we get the audio sorted out, let's do a show of hands. Who here has played? Oh, we're up and running. Okay, I'll save my show of hands. Linnea, sorry, you dropped out for a second. Please,
That's okay.
come again.
Yes. So I know virtual reality is a really new hardware, new technology, and it's often really exciting to jump on bandwagons. And I think it can be a little bit difficult to find success in these areas, just because sometimes new technologies, you're basically building the parachute while you're falling, right? And inventing it at the same time. So it really is quite a flying by the seat of your pants experience to work with these new and upcoming technologies. But I want to talk a little bit about how we approach games, how we work as a studio, and then why I think our game was successful within the sphere of virtual reality. So if we can go to the next slide. Uh, At Neat Corp, we believe that gaming is something that we will not regret, right? And that comes from a lot of the intrinsic values that we get when we play really well designed games. You saw Martin just talking about connecting with empathy through a video game and having this really profound and meaningful experience that touches you. And with Call of the Wild, you're getting back out into nature. There's these really fundamental um, moments that are resonating with nostalgia from your childhood exploring forests or your wildest imaginations of traveling to distant lands and exploring those as well, but also just kind of connecting with nature. And so I think the more that we can rely on these intrinsic values that bring us meaningful lives in the rest of our lives, that is satisfying work, real hope for success, strong social connection, and a chance to be something, part of something bigger than ourselves, the more we're going to lead happier lives. So I think games can be a big, big part of that. Next slide. So just to throw out, I love to throw out a few of these little statistics because a lot of people say, "Oh, video games, they're just a waste of time." And some video games are, if they're poorly designed or not. Yeah, some video games can be, but well-designed games can, if you play with your family, are proven to create stronger family bonds and improve behavior in children. Next slide. They're also proven to increase your trust in each other and enhance your relationships. Next slide. They're also proven to reduce stress and are even prescribed as treatments for reducing depression and anxiety. Next slide. They also help increase neural growth and encourage creativity and problem solving, especially with children. Again, these are well-designed games with this as their context. Next slide. So a lot of these elements become strengthened and heightened when we experience games in virtual reality. But this feeling of immersion and belonging that virtual reality hardware can lend also comes with greater risks of disengagement if specific design aspects are overlooked. Next slide. There have been many promises from the VR hardware manufacturers specifically, and they've been trying to deliver on these. And that we as developers have become really excited about, because whenever they're trying to sell us this hardware, and especially other studios this hardware, you get really excited about these concepts. But unfortunately, I think they kind of have been trying to sell us on the wrong thing. So I think a lot of people have been developing for the wrong type of experience, which I don't think is actually possible in virtual reality. And I think because of that, many of us developers have missed the point of what makes VR stand out and what its true strengths are. Next slide. So the hardware industry has told us, you can finally sit together and play a board game with dynamic reactions to your actions to see the effects of your decisions play out on the board in front of you. And even more recently, Facebook has been touting their online virtual office spaces to be more productive and efficient working from home than ever before, right? But this loses a lot of what makes sitting together in a space with your friends or coworkers or colleagues charming and interesting, which is the ability to see each other's faces, to bluff, smirk, smile when making a decisive move, all these small micro body language elements, which if you have a giant piece of hardware on your head is kind of blocking that, right? Because right now we do have Tobii eye tracking, which is starting to get into tracking the eyes, but it's still very uncanny valley when it gets into a live representation space. So it's not quite there in terms of that one experience delivering, of sitting in the same space, working in a virtual office. Like, if you could choose anywhere to be in the world, would you really choose to be in a cubicle in an office space? Or like, of all of your imagination, is that where you would go? No, like let's work with our colleagues and create our products on the side of a tropical beach, or on Mars, or in a fantastic mushroom kingdom. I don't know, like some crazy kooky other place that we've never been before, to help you feel inspired and excited and alive. Next slide, please. So again, I think the hardware companies have really been selling us on, connecting with each other in ways that we're used to connecting with each other, and thinking of connection from film and from seeing people in person. We know that eye contact, body language of the face is really important. Voice is really important, but the eyes are like the really most important thing. Touch is also really important. Hugging, as we've all learned now working from home for the past year and a half, uh, that being in the same physical space does have this extra nuance, extra layer. And so I think what we rather need to focus on with virtual reality is the interpersonal actions that forge connection, and the spatial experiences that bring us closer, like completing tasks together, facing a struggle together, conveying information to each other, or conveying empathy to one another, taking each other's perspective, seeing what the other person is seeing, or even something as simple as asymmetrically helpful at tasks, where I'm doing one task that you cannot perform and you're performing a task that I cannot, and by that we help each other. And I think VR hardware companies, it would be nice if they could shift their communication about this, but I think as long as software developers start to really notice the strengths of virtual reality, we can kind of get ahead of that. So I want to talk about a few of those specific areas that I've discovered when I was building my first designed for VR game, which is budget cuts. Next slide. So when you're building a game, you've got two masters. You've got the script and the system, right? You've got the script, which is like the story, the vision, the world that you're trying to deliver, and then you have all of the systems of the computer, all of the software that you're building, and those are the two things that you have control over as a creator. But what the player is engaging with, next slide, uh, is all the hardware, right? So like this is not by itself a fun toy. Like this doesn't do anything, these controllers. It's not inherently fun or engaging, and it's often off-putting and overwhelming. So you have this extra gap of educating people how to engage with the world that is much more friction to get into than you would normally have with film, for instance, where you're consuming the media very directly and intuitively. Next slide. So it's your job, right, as a developer to bridge these, and that is inherently difficult if you don't understand each of the components that you're working with. But I think that VR is one of those areas where if you understand the context of what you're building within, you will see a lot of success. Next slide. So I think one of the more successful experiments from Valve when it came to their VR lab was this experience right here, which was simply a very simple dog AI, a behavior script for the dog, which really just had to do with proximity. You know, is it close to the controller? Okay, then it's going to roll over and do the belly rub animation. Otherwise, it's going to run around and every once in a while it'll look at you, right? So it has this look at kind of information, but then it also has this proximity information. And just those two elements feel so warm and fuzzy and engaging when you're in that space. This is something that's so core and so like lighting up this fire within you in terms of this experience that you really don't need a lot of complex mechanics or systems in your game or your experience. You just need to make sure that what you are doing engages with something very core to people, very nostalgic, and very simple in terms of the interactions, right? So here, you don't even need to push a button. It's all just about physical spatial movement, which is something that we take with us from the regular world. Next slide. A lot of other games that have seen success rely upon contexts that we are familiar with, like sitting in cars or working with tools that we recognize. And this has become sort of the standard when designing for VR, and something that we definitely felt was very important when we were developing Budget Cuts. Next slide. If we look at the game Moss, which is also a highly acclaimed VR game, I'm actually going to throw a little bit of shade on it right now because I think that one of our Swedish VR developers has done a better job at this, and I'll tell you why. Moss features the adorable mouse Quill, right? And the charming animations really stole our hearts and sold the game for a lot of people. But the actual gameplay is very akin to a 2D flat game. We call them flat games when you work in VR, like the ones that are just on a screen, where you're using your controllers as regular video game controllers, and you're controlling Quill, the mouse, as you normally would. And so this kind of loses a lot of what makes virtual reality engaging and a lot of what makes the character Quill wonderful, right? Like this wonderful, cool little character, you don't want to be controlling it. You want to be engaging with it, right? And you don't want to be this big looming, you can see in the GIF here, that like you yourself are the camera looming over the space, and that doesn't help you engage and feel included or part of the narrative or what's happening. It makes you feel distant, an observer viewing from above, which might as well have been a flat screen game. Next slide. Mechanically speaking, Carly and the Reaper Man, which is made by Odd Raven Studios in Sweden, has a lot of the same mechanics. It looks different, right? The art style is different, but mechanically it's a lot of platforming, there's a little bit of combat, and the goal is the same, point A to point B on a map. where platforming puzzles are the primary mechanic. But because they utilize the strength of the space of virtual reality in using spatial puzzles, right? The VR person here is the skeleton, otherwise known as the Reaper Man, placing obstacles to work together with a cooperative player who's on the traditional couch controller mechanic to jump up and over these obstacles. By utilizing these spaces and these contexts for what they're strong in, they've created a much more resonant and much more strong design in the end. Next slide. I think also when you're talking about virtual reality, pacing is very important. A lot of people, I don't know how many of you have played virtual reality games, but those of you that have, I think it's good to describe virtual reality experiences similarly to dreams, right? Like if you're remembering having played virtual reality, it feels different than having played a flat game or having watched a movie, where those feel very explicitly abstract experiences that I've had. Yes, they're immersive. Yes, they engage you. Yes, you're drawn in to this world, to this moment. But the portion of the memory that virtual reality takes up is actually a different portion of the brain, which has to do more with spatial memory rather than story memory and narrative memory, right? So because the spatial portion of the memory of our brain is so much larger, it makes the memory of playing virtual reality hit you more like a dream, like remembering a dream, than remembering having played a different type of game or a different type of media. And so pacing also tends to then hit you a lot harder. So if you have something that's very stressful, very engaging, it'll hit you like a ton of bricks, right? Whereas, in traditional flat gaming, you often have to crank these elements up to 11 in order for players to really feel them and be impacted by them. And so there's all these tricks with like audio and music and, anticipation and timing to make that happen in flat games. But if you use that one-to-one in virtual reality, you'll often scare the pants off of whoever is playing their game. Next slide. So this is our game. This is Budget Cuts. Sorry, I've been talking about so much other stuff up until now, but I think, again, the context is really important. So in Budget Cuts, we really discovered that spatial movement was the core of what we wanted the player to experience, right? And so we do have a mechanic in here that's sort of action and violence based, right? The throwing of the knives. But really what we think of as the core mechanic is this ducking and moving behind virtual objects that don't actually exist. But because you can use this intuitive movement, it allows you to engage with the space in a very quick and easy and engaging sort of way, right? Something that feels really impactful. So what we started off with was making sure that the player wasn't being pulled out of the experience by any of the mechanics that we had to introduce. And everything was built around supporting this. You are ducking behind, playing hide and seek with these enemy robots in the same space. Next slide. So at Neat Corporation, which is the studio I work at that makes Budget Cuts, as well as other VR titles, we make sure that, actually jumping into the game and play testing is something that we do not only daily, but like almost hourly. And there's a lot of tools that we're able to utilize in virtual reality for making sure that we are, utilizing the spaces and coming across to the player in a way that engages them, in a way that leads them forward to the next area. Next slide. Here you see half of the team at Neat Corp. We are 12 people total, or almost half. It was half at the time. We've just grown to 12. And I think one of the reasons that we have felt successful in creating this game where you really do utilize what we believe the strengths are of VR and not just jumping on a bandwagon is because we do feel a lot of ownership over the games that we're making, it's our IP. We are publishing. We are launching, and and we really don't want to give that up. And we are very lucky to be able to do that through platforms like Steam and Humble Store and Oculus Store, PlayStation Store, right? But at the end of the day, I think a lot of it has to do with our approach to the new technologies, because whenever we've been trying out these new technologies of, playing with machine learning or playing with artificial intelligence, playing with NFTs, virtual reality, augmented reality, whenever we're approaching these sort of concepts, it's always about what can you actually use it for, playing around with it as a toy, seeing what clicks, what resonates, and then going off of that rather than the marketing that has been sold to us or the sound bites that you see in news reports, which is so easy to get caught up in and so easy to be misled by. And it just kind of, you need to kind of pause, stop, step back, and trust your own perspective as a consumer, but also as a developer when you're looking at these new technologies. What is it that's useful, and how can I, build everything in support of that strength, right? Next slide. So one of the things, I'm going to try to make the rest of this super quick, that we tried to do with budget cuts, and that was really revolutionary at the time, or sort of set the stage for virtual reality in terms of teleportation, was the use of our teleport gun. So or as we call it, the translocator, because you're locating to a new place. You would see this arc from your gun pointed out to a new space in the game. Next slide. And when you shoot your translocator ball into that location, a portal pops up of the new place that you are looking at to teleport to. And then next slide. If you hit the confirmation button on the controller, you then teleport to that new place. And the portal animation kind of just envelops you, so you become in that new place without having to physically move. So there's a teleport that takes time, lets you see where you're going before you get there, which is important. And most importantly, is the least nauseating of any locomotion solution in virtual reality. And for us, that was really important for inclusivity, to make sure, and accessibility, that as many people could play this as possible. And that meant reducing any kind of motion sickness that the hardware and the software can create. Next slide. And then when it came to actually playing around with this mechanic, seeing around corners, being able to get that third person's perspective that you would normally get in stealth games that are not in first person, it really meant that we were able to create this very sneaky, stealthy, thief-like almost experience. And you kind of felt like you were a kid again, pretending to be a spy and sneaking around under the sofa and stuff like that. Next slide. So we did our best to try to play with spaces that felt very realistic and very familiar in terms of being, normal office spaces, three-dimensional objects and furniture set in a context that was familiar. Next slide. But of course, we also needed to deliver a narrative, because a lot of gamers need this sort of story link to keep you engaged. And we also kind of wanted to tell a story and have a bit of an impact through that with characters as well. So many of our levels, though having this branching option with how you engage, do you want to go action and throw knives? Do you want to sneak through vents without ever killing a single robot? You can do that as well. It was really a no-brainer for us to provide those options, but still sort of lead the player on through these linear levels. Next slide. Every once in a while, though, we would have our boss rooms or boss puzzles, which were these much more open-ended, circular sort of choose your own adventure, almost open world in terms of like that level enclosed was open world. You could do whichever section first you wanted, and that was also part of the puzzle. And I think that helped with the engagement of people feeling like they were in a true space, almost like you are in a room escape puzzle in the real world. And so we drew a lot of inspiration from those types of scavenger hunts, if you want to, liken them a bit. Next slide. So we definitely tried to make sure that we didn't pull away, detract from any of the aha moments in virtual reality where you realize you're not actually in this virtual space because the hardware is so new, because people are exploring it for the first time. They are getting so many of these like, I can't believe I'm actually in a different space and I'm not just in my living room. And one of those moments, though it was sometimes a little bit headache inducing, was this specific moment where you're climbing in the roof of the office space, and you can open up this little hole to look down into the office and see if there's an enemy there. And so many players tried to put their head through the floor because in the virtual world, there is a hole there for you to look down. But in the real world, it's actually your floor. And it kind of makes you realize in that moment just how immersed, just how in this other world you were, and the strength of the hardware. And I think given the context of virtual reality just releasing to consumer market, that was something that we definitely needed to lean into and not remove from the player's experience. Next slide. So whether in budget cuts you are someone who wants to experience more thrill and get more of that AAA action type of combat gameplay, or next slide, if you are playing hide and seek and feeling this sort of childlike nostalgia for these games that you played growing up, exploring a space that you've never done before because you have this toy, this VR headset that you've never had before, which is also a little bit of a childlike nostalgia of getting this new hardware that's completely new and amazing. We want to try to make sure that we find those little kernels of experiences that are unique, that are impactful, that are nostalgic, that are core, and we support that with all of our design principles as much as possible. So my takeaway from all of this and what I'd like to leave you with is that no matter what new technology you're exploring, I would say, try as much as possible to just block out what everybody else is telling you is good about it, is exciting about it. Test it yourself. And if there's something that strikes you as interesting, then that's probably the true thread that you should be following when developing for that. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks a lot, Linnea. A lot of your work on budget cuts and after has been groundbreaking. But I'm very fascinated by the translocator. Have you seen others copy that mechanic in other games?
Yes, almost one-to-one. Very, very, very explicitly. Yes.
Well, isn't that a recognition then of sorts when others take your work and do the same?
We do think so. The thing that's also quite interesting is there's this vocal minority popping up with virtual reality that, oh, you just have to toughen up and get used to the motion sickness and it's fine. It's not the best way to experience this. Teleporting is for weaklings. But I think it's important that, we stand our ground as developers and say, this is the proper experience. This is what's good for most players. And it is very humbling and very wonderful to feel that other developers are recognizing that by copying the mechanic of the translocator.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Linnea. We'll see you in an hour or so for the panel. So looking forward to ask more questions then. Thank you very much.